country, and what could keep community college students enrolled. And we were doing experiments in different community colleges around the country, and one of them was Delgado Community College and Louisiana Technical College in New Orleans. And the people who were running the study said, the hurricane hit and all of our data is destroyed. And I thought to myself, well, when a hurricane or a natural disaster hits, I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that it's very rare to have pre-disaster data. And this study had been asking people about their physical health, their mental health. We asked questions like, who would you reach out to in times of trouble? Do you trust the government? Social network data. And so we had a lot of data on these people. And the funding came from the Louisiana Department of Social Services. And so the sample is mostly single mothers who were within poverty guidelines so that they would have been eligible for TANF funds, welfare funds, to be used for this study. So we had about 1,000, a little bit over 1,000 single mothers enrolled in the community college. Their family income was less than 200% of the poverty level. And they were almost all female. In the follow-up, we've just been following up the females, overwhelmingly African American, in their mid-20s. And so the story about our sample is it's not a random sample of New Orleans. It's not the poorest of the poor. It's people who are trying to go to community college, but they were pretty poor, and they were all the mothers of young children. A disproportionate number of our respondents came from the 9th Ward. We did a survey. We had 2 data points before the hurricane hit. We were literally interviewing when the hurricane hit. We went back and we found 82% of these people, wherever they were around the country after the hurricane hit, because we had their social security numbers, because it was a longitudinal study. And basically what I also learned is if you give someone your social security number, they can find you wherever you go. We also did in-depth interviews, qualitative interviews, with a subsample of the women, with half of them in the New Orleans area, back in New Orleans a year after the hurricane, and half of them in Texas, mostly in Houston, but also in Dallas. The advantages, as I said, are that we had a lot of data from before the hurricane, and also what we do know from disaster research is that poor people and members of minority groups are most at risk for suffering from a disaster. If you don't know New Orleans too well, the Orleans Parish is coterminous with the city of New Orleans. East New Orleans suffered a lot from the floods. Lakeview is a well-off area, also suffered from the floods, which came in from the lake. There was also breaches in various canals that flooded the 9th Ward and the downtown area. This is a map of the depths of the flooding, the red and the black with the highest flooding. Here's the lower 9th Ward. Here's Lakeview, East New Orleans. The extent of the flood goes out in many different directions. And this is a map, and each of the dots is one of our respondents in our survey before the hurricane hit. So some of them living out in the suburbs that did not get flooded, and the size of the red dot is how large the flooding was at their house. So you can see that this area of the lower 9th Ward, we had many, many people living there, and also in New Orleans East. So people who really suffered a great deal. This is just to show you that about 45% of our sample lived in the 9th Ward. So they were disproportionately hit by the flooding. So what we first did was to do a number of studies looking at the data that we had pre-hurricane in terms of social resources, psychological resources, social support, and looking at outcomes after the hurricane to see what kind of what knowing about how you were before the hurricane could help in understanding how the hurricane affected your social and psychological outcomes. And we measured two things. One was depression, and the other was PTSD. Now, we had a measure of depression before the hurricane hit because we had collected that data as part of the community college study. But PTSD, we only collected afterwards, and PTSD was kind of common among people. And one of the things that we found, when you do a survey, it's common at the end of a telephone survey, if any of you have done one, to say at the end, is there anything you'd like to add? Because people have been doing multiple choice questions for a long time. And the survey researchers just typed in what people were saying, and there was only room, it's like a Twitter kind of thing, there was only room for a certain number of words. But if you read through what we heard from people at the end of the survey, it was really awful. I mean, people are saying, I had a baby, it was hard, helicopters didn't pick them up, we were stranded on the roof, I tried to get my grandma to come with me, we couldn't, it was horrible, my mom was trapped in the attic. This lady said she was pregnant. Many of our respondents actually were pregnant during the storm. Baby was born at 26 weeks on the roof of the house, surrounded by water. The baby didn't survive. This is just from the tail end of the survey. So it was just overwhelming to us, the kinds of things people wanted to tell us about what they had lived through. Now, this is from our in-depth interviews a year after the storm. And I have two quotes just so that I'm about to give you some quantitative data about people having PTSD. But I think this gives you a sense of the kinds of experiences people have when we measure PTSD. This is what kinds of things happen to them. So the interviewer says, was your daughter sick before the hurricane? And the respondent says, no. And she says, she came on with a fever when we got rescued. We were on top of the roof and it was raining hard. The wind was blowing and we was just hoping and praying somebody will come get us. And we was really hoping that the house didn't fall because of all the water. And I mean, you'd have to be like it to see what really happened. It's just so hard to explain because I thought it was a dream. This is the kind of disassociation people talk about. All I kept telling myself, it's a dream, wake up. It's a dream. And once we got to the old folks' home, we had to walk 5 feet of that mess in water to get to it, the second or third floor. We found out they had dead bodies on the first floor from old folks who didn't get out. So it was a whole lot of people. And what they did was kind of like we went to corner stores and broke in there and tried to get food and stuff so everybody could survive. And then this is a woman who's back now, a different woman, who had been at the convention center, and she's back working now in New Orleans. And she has to take the bus every day, and the bus goes past the convention center on her way to work. And she says, yes, I was at the convention center. I was crying because they left there with no food, sleeping on the ground. And I was crying, and I knew I shouldn't because my kids were right there. So that was making him cry too, and I couldn't help it. You can never get away from what happened, especially when at the Superdome and Convention Center. We will never get over that, how they left us. That's one thing that will always be on my mind. When I'm on the bus going to work or dropping my kids off, I have to pass the Convention Center on the bus. And every time I pass it, the memories just come back. And when my children are on the bus with me, they always say, that's where we were at, that's where we slept, and I'm never going to get over it. So she talks about how she's just triggered each time she goes past this experience, and the PTSD experience comes back, and she has to cope with the horribleness of it again. So what we gathered was data on how much trauma and loss people experienced in the hurricane, their demographic characteristics, their economic status, the amount of social support that they had. And then we had our dependent variables were their mental health before the storm and after the storm, and a scale that measures PTSD, as well as we had measures of their physical health before the storm. We had measures on self-reported health, whether it was fair or poor, number of diagnosed medical conditions, their body mass index. We also had data on drugs and alcohol use. et cetera. And for the people in our sample, actually 83% of them did evacuate before the storm hit, although many of the people who evacuated also suffered a lot of trauma along the way. Many of them had housing, water, and damage that was enormous, personal property damage that was enormous, and lost everything in the flood. This is a list of the hurricane traumas that people could have. Did not have enough fresh water to drink, didn't know if their families were okay. The last one is any of your relatives or close friends killed because of Hurricane Katrina or Rita. And at first we thought that 31% having somebody very close to them die was a very high number, because only 1,800 people actually died in the whole hurricane. But because so many of people, our people were from the lower Ninth Ward, we actually asked a follow-up question and asked who was it that died, and it generally was either an elderly relative or somebody from their block or somebody that they knew quite well. So we actually do trust these data. So first we asked what happened to the physical and mental health of people, and what we found was that their psychological and physical distress worsened quite a bit in the first year after the hurricane. So there's the depression scale is called the K6 scale, and that doubled. So the level of depression in the sample doubled over time. The fair or poor related health status went up quite a bit. The number of diagnosed medical conditions went up. And the mental illness was very much similar to national study or local studies of much larger numbers of people in New Orleans. So it went up from 7 to 14% of people with serious depression. About half of our sample had PTSD symptoms a year after post-traumatic stress disorder. Things like shaking or anxiety or not being able to get thoughts out of your mind or phobias, those kinds of things. And what we found was that the loss and trauma that people experienced were related to health status. And what we also found was, and this is very important for studies of disasters, because usually there is no physical or mental health status before the hurricane. So the answer, the question that people always have is, yes, you're depressed after the hurricane, but maybe you were depressed before the hurricane. How do we know that the hurricane or the disaster caused it? And what we find is that controlling for baseline depression or health characteristics does not at all explain away the increase that happens, although it does reduce it somewhat, so that people with pre-existing depression are more likely to have a decline in their mental health following the hurricane. We also looked at a question of whether or not, if you had more income, if you had access to a working car, if you had a bigger social network, would that have prevented you from experiencing some of the losses in mental and physical health after the hurricane. And what we found was that having more resources, income, access to a car, even a bigger friendship network, did tend to make you evacuate more, so that it did tend to prevent losses, but it did nothing to buffer you from the psychological and physical results of the hurricane if you experienced the traumas. So it reduced the number of traumas you experienced, but it did not at all help you to have more resources if you did experience the hurricane traumas. So then we went back in the field 5 years later and re-interviewed the women. And we did a second follow-up. And we looked at what was the trajectory of their mental health over the period between the first and second follow-up. And what we find is that overall, and this is in terms of PTSD, we had two measures, 67% are either never had PTSD or had it at the first follow-up and don't have it anymore.